The British Empire, once a global superpower, left an indelible mark on the world. Its legacy, however, is not one of unblemished glory. While often portrayed as a benevolent force, a closer look reveals a darker side. The empire's expansion came at a tremendous cost to its colonies, leaving behind a legacy of exploitation, oppression, and enduring trauma. This essay delves into the dark underbelly of the British Empire, examining its devastating impact on the lives of millions across the globe. From the Indian subcontinent to the shores of Africa and the islands of the Caribbean, the British Empire's pursuit of power and profit left a trail of shattered societies and broken lives. This is not to deny the achievements of British civilization, yet, any honest appraisal of its legacy must contend with the uncomfortable truth of its imperial past. The history of the British Empire is a sobering reminder that the quest for dominance often comes at a steep human cost. India, often referred to as the jewel in the crown of the British Empire, endured centuries of systematic exploitation. The British East India Company, established in 1600, gradually gained control over vast swaths of the subcontinent. The company's relentless pursuit of profit led to the impoverishment of India's once thriving textile industry. Indian weavers were forced out of business, unable to compete with the cheap machine-made textiles flooding in from Britain. This economic exploitation was coupled with political subjugation. The British government formally took control of India in 1858, following the Sepoy Mutiny. The mutiny, sparked by a number of grievances including British insensitivity to Indian religious practices, was brutally suppressed. The aftermath saw the installation of a viceroy and the tightening of British control over all aspects of Indian life. Education, administration, and the legal system were all restructured to serve British interests. The scramble for Africa in the late 19th century saw European powers, including Britain, carve up the continent with ruthless efficiency. Borders were drawn with little regard for existing ethnic or cultural divisions, sowing the seeds of future conflicts. The British Empire, driven by a thirst for raw materials and new markets, established colonies across East, West, and Southern Africa. The exploitation of Africa's resources was central to the British imperial project. Vast reserves of gold, diamonds, rubber, and other valuable commodities were extracted, enriching the coffers of the British Empire while leaving African economies depleted. The construction of railroads and infrastructure, often touted as signs of progress, primarily served to facilitate the extraction and transportation of these resources to ports bound for Britain. The Caribbean islands, once home to thriving indigenous populations, were transformed into sugar-producing colonies by European powers. The British Empire played a leading role in this brutal chapter of history. The indigenous populations were decimated by disease and forced labor. To meet the insatiable demand for sugar in Europe, millions of Africans were forcibly transported to the Caribbean as slaves. The transatlantic slave trade was a horrific enterprise, responsible for the deaths of millions of Africans. Those who survived the perilous journey faced a life of unimaginable cruelty on the sugar plantations. The abolition of slavery in 1833 did little to alleviate the suffering of the enslaved population. Former slaves were often forced to remain on the plantations as apprentices, receiving meager wages and enduring harsh working conditions. Section 5. The Plunder of Resources, Economic Exploitation on a Grand Scale. Economic exploitation was a defining feature of British colonialism. The empire's pursuit of profit knew no bounds, and its colonies were treated as little more than sources of raw materials and captive markets. India's once thriving textile industry was deliberately dismantled to eliminate competition for British manufacturers. Africa's vast mineral wealth was plundered to fuel British industry. The Caribbean islands were transformed into vast sugar plantations, worked by enslaved Africans. This systematic exploitation had a devastating impact on the economies of the colonies. Local industries were destroyed, traditional agricultural practices were disrupted, and entire populations were forced into poverty. The wealth extracted from these colonies flowed back to Britain, enriching the British elite and financing the empire's continued expansion. Section 6. Erasing Identities, Cultural Suppression, and the Loss of Heritage. British colonialism went beyond economic and political domination. It sought to reshape the cultural fabric of its colonies. Indigenous languages and traditions were often suppressed, seen as barriers to civilizing the native populations. Christian missionaries, often working hand-in-hand with colonial authorities, sought to convert local populations to Christianity, denigrating indigenous belief systems as primitive or heathen. Educational systems were restructured to instill British values and worldviews. Local languages were often replaced with English as the language of instruction, further marginalizing indigenous cultures. This cultural assault had a profound impact on the identities of colonized peoples, leaving a legacy of cultural alienation and a disconnect from their own heritage. Section 7. The Human Cost: Forced Labor, Displacement, and Genocide. The human cost of British colonialism is immeasurable. Millions of lives were lost as a direct result of colonial policies. Forced labor regimes such as the indentured servitude system that replaced slavery resulted in the deaths of countless individuals. The brutal suppression of rebellions and uprisings often involved massacres and atrocities. In some instances, British colonial policies led to devastating famines. The most infamous example is the Bengal famine of 1943, which claimed the lives of an estimated 3 million people. While the famine was caused by a complex interplay of factors, including natural disasters, British policies, such as the diversion of food grains to support the war effort, exacerbated the crisis. Section 8. The Long Shadow of Empire: Lasting Consequences for Former Colonies. The legacy of British colonialism continues to cast a long shadow over its former colonies. The arbitrary borders drawn by colonial powers have left a legacy of ethnic tensions and conflicts. The economic exploitation of the colonial era has resulted in enduring poverty and underdevelopment in many parts of the world. The cultural suppression of indigenous languages and traditions has created a sense of cultural alienation and a disconnect from pre-colonial pasts. The challenges faced by these nations are complex and multifaceted, but it is undeniable that the legacy of colonialism continues to shape their present-day realities. Addressing these challenges requires acknowledging the injustices of the past and working towards a more just and equitable future. Section 9. Conclusion: Facing the Past, Shaping the Future. The British Empire, for all its claims of civilization and progress, left a trail of devastation and suffering in its wake. From the forced displacement of populations to the systematic plunder of resources, the human cost of British colonialism was staggering. The cultural suppression of indigenous traditions and languages further compounded the trauma of colonization. As we grapple with the complex legacies of empire, it is essential to acknowledge the enduring impact of colonialism on the world today. Only by confronting the darker chapters of our shared history can we begin to build a future free from the ghosts of empire. This requires a commitment to social justice, economic equality, and the celebration of cultural diversity. Please like and subscribe for more content.